Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to Ballotpedia's webinar on 2018 marijuana ballot measures. My name is Ryan Byrne. I'm a staff writer on the Ballot Measures Project. Also on this webinar is Josh Altick, who is the project director of the Ballot Measures Project at Ballotpedia. We will be discussing 7 marijuana-related ballot measures, including 2 recreational measures and 5 medical marijuana measures. In 2018, Michigan and North Dakota will be voting on recreational, also known as adult use, marijuana ballot measures, and 7 states will be voting on medical marijuana. 9 states have already legalized adult use marijuana, and 8 of those states came through the ballot initiative process. Both of the measures on the ballot in 2018 also came through the ballot initiative process, which requires citizens to gather signatures to get their issue on the ballot. You can see our full list of marijuana-related ballot measures on ballotpedia.org/marijuana on the ballot, and that page will allow you to sort the measures by state or by year. So first up, we're going to talk about Michigan Proposal 1. So, like I said, Michigan Proposal 1 would legalize the recreational use of and possession of marijuana. It has a number of characteristics that are different from previous measures or similar to just a few of them. So, for example, the possession limit under Proposal 1 would be 2.5 ounces of marijuana, which would be the highest possession amount in the U.S., along with the state of Maine, which was legalized through a ballot initiative and has the same possession limit. There are kind of a number of nuances to this, however. Some states do allow higher levels of possession if the possession is just within one's home. Michigan's initiative does not make that difference, but some states allow up to 10 ounces within the home, just not out on the person in other places. In 2016, the measures that legalized marijuana all allowed 1 ounce for possession purposes, as well as Colorado and Washington, which were the first 2 states to legalize marijuana. Michigan Proposal 1 would allow 12 marijuana plants to be grown within one's home, which is also the highest limit, which would be the highest limit in the U.S. Most states, if they do allow home grow, allow around 6 plants. The tax rate on marijuana sales would be 10%, which would be the lowest in the U.S. But once again, there's kind of some qualifications here when we say that. Nevada also has a 10% sales tax, but in addition to the sales tax, they have a 15% sales tax, an additional sales tax when there's a sale made from a cultivator to a retailer, and then 10% from retailer to consumer. Alaska doesn't really use a sales tax. They have a cultivation tax. And some states actually had a lower tax in the original ballot measure proposal, such as Massachusetts, which had a 3.5% tax, so significantly lower, but the state legislature increased it after the measure was approved in 2016. And Colorado's measure didn't include a tax, but rather tasks the legislature with developing a tax, which currently stands at 15% for retail to consumer sales tax. Michigan Proposal 1 also includes a unique provision regarding what the initiative calls micro businesses. These are kind of based on the idea of microbreweries regarding alcohol. So what a micro business would allow is for vertical integration of cultivation, the processing of marijuana, and the sale of marijuana. But this would only be available to businesses growing not more than 150 plants. So if an individual or business wants to grow more than 150 plants, then they need to be licensed as a cultivator, not as a micro business, in which they cannot sell what they cultivate directly to consumers. They'll have to sell it to a retailer who would then sell it to consumers. Polling on Michigan Proposal 1 as an average over time has been around 54% in support, 39% opposed, and 8% undecided. I also looked at an aggregation of polls just since September 1st, and it was strikingly similar to the entire 2008 aggregation. So just since September 1st, the polls have varied a bit. So support has been, in one poll, 43%, which was still plurality in that poll. That poll had a lot more people undecided. 55%, 56%, and 62%. Polls have also showed that while there are partisan differences in support for Proposal 1, the strongest variables were actually age, not political party affiliation, with younger voters supporting it and older voters opposing it. The campaign finance hasn't showed any significant expenditures yet, but one reason that might be the case is that campaign finance reports in Michigan are kind of spaced out. The numbers that we currently have are only valid through July 25th, 2018. The next deadline is October 26, 2018. So right before the election, we'll be finding out a lot more about the campaign finance surrounding Proposal 1. Currently, as of the July 25th date, supporters had 1.74 million compared to opponents who had 286,000. If Proposal 1 passes in November and the legislature wants to amend anything in Proposal 1, it would require a 3/4 vote in the state house and a 3/4 vote in the state senate, plus the governor's signature. And just to help understand what this would look like, so pre-November 2018, so currently, Michigan is a Republican trifecta state. The governor's Republican, but the Republicans do not control 3/4 of either chamber. They come close in the Senate, controlling about 71% of the seats, but in the House, they control about 57% of the seats. So under current arrangements, there would need to be some support from Democrats in order for the majority to change anything about Proposal 1.
Great, thanks, Ryan. The other recreational legalization measure on the ballot is North Dakota Measure 3. North Dakota Measure 3 is pretty unique in that it has almost no details attached to it. It would remove marijuana from sort of the state's Schedule I substances and would have a provision sort of preventing any prosecution for charges related specifically to non-violent marijuana-related activity, with an exception for distribution to a minor, and that's related to those over 21. The measure would require sort of any distribution or possession charges regarding a minor to sort of be treated the same as alcohol possession. So possession by a minor, distribution to a minor, or distribution by a minor would all be handled according to the state's rules for alcohol. And then, besides that, it would the proponents have stated that they wanted to leave the details of the measure up to the legislature. Opponents have sort of treated that as just being vague and allowing for a very sort of liberal measure. So there's sort of a difference on opinion about what this does, but the measure doesn't have any details about quantity limits or home grow limits or taxation and revenue allocation, or local control, sort of common provisions that you'd see in the other measures that have passed. It also has a fairly unique provision that would automatically expunge any history or convictions for past crimes related to marijuana. And actually that provision doesn't specifically mention marijuana. It's about any controlled substance. So it relates to automatic expungement of any past convictions about a controlled substance that is then legalized according to state law. That would clearly sort of, it would apply to marijuana specifically in this case, but it doesn't specifically mention marijuana. So there's an appeal process if the automatic expungement doesn't happen immediately. So if someone who has a prior conviction believes they qualify for this and it hasn't happened automatically, they can appeal for it. And there's certain timelines related to when it has to happen. 30 days after the measure is put into effect, that process for the automatic expungement would have to start taking place. The polling is a little bit limited on this measure. For the two polls that we've tracked, there's very differing results, and the reactions to those have been kind of contradictory as well. So there was a poll in February that was actually commissioned by the proponents of the measure and run by the Kitchens Group, which showed a plurality of support for the measure, 46% support, 39% opposition, and 15% undecided. Then there was a poll done by the Odney polling firm in August that showed very, very different results, with 38% support, 56% opposition. So there's not a clear sort of trend regarding how this measure is doing yet. For campaign finance, North Dakota is a fairly small state, but there was not a lot spent on getting this measure to the ballot. Tracked $32,000 spent by the support committee, and the two committees registered in opposition have reported $114,000 in contributions. In North Dakota, to amend or repeal an initiative, the legislature requires a 2/3 vote for 7 years after the measure passes. That wouldn't for the details sort of mentioned above, like taxation, quantity limits, home grow rules, dispensary location rules, that would not really be an issue because they were just left open in this measure. So the legislature would not have to change the initiative to enact those details. Yeah. And then Ryan's going to run through sort of some historical political context for the measures that have passed.
Great, yeah. So we've looked at a number of political variables, primarily results in the previous presidential elections, as well as state partisan control at the time that the measure was on the ballot. And as you can see, most of the states that have had ballot initiatives related to recreational marijuana legalization were in states where the Democratic presidential nominee won in 2008, 2012, and 2016. The only state that has approved recreational marijuana that doesn't kind of fall into that category of Democratic victories for the 3 past presidential elections is Alaska, where Republicans have actually won in the past 3 elections, and the state at the time was controlled by Republicans in the legislature and governor's office. We can see that in 2015 and 2016, we saw 2 measures get rejected. Ohio, which we've classified as a pivot state, it's a state that voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. And in Arizona, which voted Republican in the past 3 elections. There is another proposal in Ohio, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that's coming up next year, or may come up next year. They're currently collecting signatures for it. So as you can see with Michigan, Michigan is a pivot state, much like Ohio. It voted for Obama twice and then Trump. The current partisan control is Republican. Michigan would also be the first state in the Midwest to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. Currently, it's kind of divided between states that are west of the Rockies, along with 2 New England states, which are Massachusetts and Maine, as well as Vermont, which came through the legislative process. North Dakota would be kind of similar to Alaska. It has voted Republican in the past 3 elections and currently is under Republican control. Though I think some commentators would note that Alaska kind of has a bit of a different political history than a lot of other states that have voted Republican in the past couple presidential elections. So now we can talk about kind of what's next in recreational marijuana, and we have a map for that. So as you can see on this map, like I was saying, legalization has primarily occurred west of the Rockies and a little bit in New England. And in 2018, we have votes coming up in Michigan and North Dakota. And the current, so what happened here is that most of these came through the ballot initiative process, all of them but Vermont. So this leaves kind of a question of what states could still legalize marijuana through the initiative process rather than the legislature. And you can see all these states in orange still have that opportunity. It's kind of a diagonal line from Idaho and Montana in the northwest down to Florida in the southeast, as well as Arizona and Ohio, which both have seen measures but have rejected them. The Ohio measure was rejected in 2015. It was a bit different from the other ones in that it would have created 10 facilities on pre-designated properties that would have exclusive rights to grow marijuana, and those 10 properties were already owned by donors of the campaign. So it was a bit different. There was a lot of anti-monopoly language being used by opponents, including some marijuana advocates who ended up opposing it. So like I said, we could see marijuana again in 2019 in Ohio. There's currently a measure being circulated. And there have been some discussions about Arizona again as well, but in 2020. There's other variables you have to consider besides just this light orange color as places where you can use the ballot initiative to legalize marijuana. There are different types of initiatives available to citizens, as well as different procedural requirements. So, for example, in Florida, initiatives have to be constitutional and require a 60% vote. So if you got marijuana on the ballot in Florida, it would need to be a constitutional amendment, and it would need a 60% vote of the public to actually be passed. And then you see Illinois, which some people might think as like, oh, well, why hasn't there been a marijuana initiative in Illinois? It would seem like a state that might approve it based on the previous states that have approved. And Illinois has really strict subject restrictions with initiatives. Initiatives can only amend structural and procedural subjects related to the state legislature. So getting a marijuana initiative on the ballot through those restrictions might be kind of difficult and probably wouldn't stand up in the courts too well. But yes, so the light orange states, as well as the two dark orange states, are, for the most part, states that could still see marijuana legalization on the ballot in the future.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So we'll kind of move into medical marijuana. And in November 2018, voters in Utah and Missouri will be voting on medical marijuana. In Missouri, there are 3 different measures. Ryan will give the breakdown on those. And then already this year in June, Oklahoma voters approved State Question 788. So we'll go through those measures. So in June, 56.9% of Oklahoma voters approved State Question 788. The initiative required a signature by a physician. It had a 3-ounce limit on personal possession, as well as other limitations for in-home and things like that. It allowed 6 mature and 6 seeding plants for home grow. It had a 7% excise tax on sales, which did not replace the existing sales tax in Oklahoma. So that was on top of the existing sales tax. It also, with regard to local control, sort of prevented local ordinances banning dispensaries or restricting where dispensaries could be located, and had a 1,000-foot buffer between schools and a few other provisions. One of the interesting things that came out of that measure was after it passed, the Oklahoma Board of Health, which is sort of tasked with providing some rules and regulations to fill in the gaps for the measure, proposed a set of rules that had a lot of restrictions, including a ban on smoking marijuana. There was also a mandatory pregnancy test for certain demographics, and a bunch of other restrictions that were kind of quickly opposed by proponents of the initiative, and 2 lawsuits were filed. And ultimately, sort of some more basic rules were enacted in August, and the governor signed those. But that was sort of similar to a situation in Florida in 2016, where the amendment was passed and the legislature implemented it through a set of rules that banned smoking marijuana. So reminded me of that. And for campaign finance, the support, it started out, there was actually a nonprofit that was running the initiative campaign, and they reported to Ballotpedia that they spent right around $30,000 on the actual signature gathering process, and that wasn't reported through the campaign finance system, so that can be added. But after the signature gathering process, sort of during the campaign, about $280,000 was reported by support, and opposition reported about $1.3 million. So that measure was passed. There was during the discussion after the measure passed about the specific rules, 2 different initiatives, one regarding medical and one regarding recreational, were circulated and sort of made an effort to get on the November ballot. And those would have been, the recreational one specifically would have been on the ballot in November. That was the effort, but they failed to qualify for the ballot after missing an August signature deadline. So we can move on from that one. So the measure that's on the ballot in November is Utah Proposition 2. Proposition 2 would sort of establish a 15 licensed cultivation facilities limit. So there'd be 15 facilities to cultivate, and then that would be reevaluated in 2022. Dispensaries would be limited based on the number of residents in a county, which was important. It was the number of residents in the county divided by 150,000. That was important because of the home grow rules that are included in the initiative, which depend on how far away a dispensary is from your residence. If a dispensary was more than 100 miles away, the closest dispensary was, then home grow would be allowed. Medical cards would be granted according to certain qualifying conditions, but the initiative would also establish a board called the Compassionate Board. The board would be responsible for sort of processing requests for medical cards that did not fall immediately within the qualifying conditions. So that Compassionate Use Board would consider those requests. And the initiative also would ban smoking marijuana, public use of marijuana, and have provisions regarding driving under the influence and things like that. So polling, Ballotpedia's sort of aggregation of polls show kind of over the last year and a half, show a 70.5% support and 25.25% opposed. The polls in the later half of 2018, so since May, show a slightly lower support margin of kind of an average of about 65%. So there's been sort of a slight drop off in the most recent polls, with the highest support results coming sort of in 2017 or earlier in 2018. The highest result recorded was from July 2017. The lowest result reported was actually the most recent poll in late September, early October, with 64% in support. For campaign finance, the support committee, Legalize ND, has raised about 32,000. The opposition committees have reported about 114,000. I'm sorry, I was looking at North Dakota. The Utah Patients Coalition, which is supporting the Utah measure, has reported 866,000. And the currency of these reports, we've processed through any interim reports available as of October 3rd. The next deadline for full reports of all campaign finance information is October 31. So these reports cover campaign finance sort of in total through September 26th, and then any interim reports required. The two committees were registered in opposition, Drug Safe Utah and a committee called Truth About Proposition 2. They reported almost 1 million in opposition. And an interesting development sort of most recently is there's been discussion of a compromise between proponents of the initiative and then various opponent groups like the Church of Latter-day Saints and other organizations that sort of opposed it, as well as the legislature. So there's been this semi-agreement about a compromise, and that would be contingent on the legislature acting after the initiative was approved. The legislature is able to amend or repeal or change initiative provisions in Utah. It's one of 11 states that allows the legislature to make changes without any sort of supermajority requirement or any time limitation. And then most recently, Governor Gary Herbert called for a special session of the legislature after the November election, and he said that they would meet to sort of figure out some rules and changes to medical marijuana policy in Utah, whether or not the initiative passed. So we should see that session happening. If Proposition 2 passed, they would consider these aforementioned changes that have been agreed upon. There haven't been a lot of details released about exactly what that compromise entails. All right, so moving on to Missouri. which is very confusing, and Ryan will walk us through that.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, Missouri, there's a complex scenario in Missouri because we actually have 3 ballot initiatives that would legalize medical marijuana. So when voters go to their ballots in November, unless they're doing early voting, they will see 3 different ballot initiatives that would legalize medical marijuana. I'm going to go over briefly what exactly that entails. But first, I want to just highlight some of the differences that have come up in the campaigning and in commentary surrounding these 3 measures, kind of the specifics that help distinguish them. But if you want to see all the different characteristics and provisions of these ballot initiatives and how they compare, you can go to ballotpedia.org/Missouri 2018 ballot measures, and it goes through all the various provisions of these ballot initiatives and how they compare. But just to highlight a few, Amendment 2 is sponsored by a group called New Approach Missouri. It's a constitutional amendment, which means to amend or repeal Amendment 2 in the future, there would need to be a simple majority vote in the legislature plus voter approval. The same thing can be said about Amendment 3, but not Proposition C. Since Proposition C is a statute, it would require a simple majority vote in the legislature plus the governor's signature to amend or repeal. Another difference that has been highlighted between these 3 measures are their tax provisions and their revenue allocation provisions. As you can see, the taxation rates vary. Amendment 2, 4%, Amendment 3, 15%, and Proposition C at the lowest, 2%. The revenue distribution also varies. While Proposition C would allocate revenue to a number of different areas, including veterans services, drug treatment, education, and law enforcement, Amendment 2 would allocate revenue to veterans services, broadly defined, which would include more specifics like veteran healthcare, veteran housing, and veteran job assistance. Amendment 3 would allocate revenue to an entirely new institution called the Biomedical Research and Drug Development Institute, which would be tasked with developing cures. And just to go over that a little bit more, because it is such a unique provision of this measure, this board would also oversee the medical marijuana program, whereas existing government agencies would oversee the program in Amendment 2 and Proposition C. The Drug Development Institute would be tasked, like I said, with finding cures for diseases, but also generating income for the state from cures that the Institute develops. And revenue would be distributed once from these cures to other various topics, such as being reinvested in the Institute for administration and research purposes, income tax rebates, transportation, education, state medical care, and the Public Employee Retirement Trust Fund. So an individual would appoint the 9 members to this board. This individual is known as the Article 14 coordinator. Amendment 3 would make the Institute's first Article 14 coordinator the ballot initiative's sponsor and proponent. His name is Brad Bradshaw. So Brad Bradshaw would be the first Article 14 coordinator who would appoint the board members of this institute. When Bradshaw eventually decides to no longer serve as the Article 14 coordinator, the governor would then appoint a new coordinator. And we can move on to discussing kind of what the implications are of having 3 measures on the ballot. So the question comes up is, what happens if all 3 of these measures are approved? So if Amendment 2 and Amendment 3 are approved, the amendment receiving the most votes wins. So let's say Amendment 2 gets 60%, Amendment 3 gets 55%. Who wins? Amendment 2 wins. So, but what if Proposition C is approved? Along with Amendment 2, Amendment 3, or both of them, and Proposition C wins more votes than the amendments. Well, then this issue might need to be decided in court. So state law does not currently address the conflict between initiated amendments and statutes. Um, Although if you look at the commentary and the news around these measures, it's generally seen by a lot of legal experts that constitutional law generally is considered precedent over statute. So if Proposition C gets, and obviously I'm just making up very large numbers here, let's say it gets 80% of the vote, Proposition Amendment 2 and Amendment 3 are passed, but Proposition C got a lot more votes. Does Proposition C go into effect, or does the higher of Amendment 2 or Amendment 3 go into effect because they're constitutional law? And can the constitutional amendments and statute go into effect at the same time? Well, this is why the Attorney General in 2016, when there was a similar scenario on the ballot involving tobacco taxes, said ultimately the courts would probably need to step in and decide exactly what to do here. So I don't think I made that scenario any more less complex, but this is generally what would happen if we saw all three of them approved, especially if we see Proposition C come out on top, is that the courts may need to step in to kind of settle what's happening in terms of what's going into effect and what's not. So the campaign finance reports were just updated yesterday, October 15th, and they covered all of the campaign finance reporting through September 30th. The next reports are due October 29th. You can see the campaign finance there. So New Approach Missouri, which is supporting Amendment 1, is actually also spending some of its funds to oppose Amendment 3. Or rather, sorry, it supports Amendment 2, opposes 3. Find the Cure supports Amendment 3. And Missourians for Patients Care supports Proposition C. You can see there that all of them have collected somewhere in the 1 millions. There are some opposition groups as well, Citizens for Safe Medicine, and another group that's specifically just opposed to Amendment 3, which is called Patients Against Bradshaw Amendment. But as of yesterday, with the most recent report, both of these committees still stood at $0 reporting. So they may still get some before the next report, but through September 30th, neither of them have reported any contributions. We've seen a lot of the national marijuana legalization and policy-related organizations, such as Marijuana Policy Project, the Drug Policy Action, which is the political arm of the Drug Policy Alliance, and the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, also known as NORML, backing Amendment 2 over Amendment 3 or Proposition C. We've also seen Senator Claire McCaskill, who's up for re-election this year, endorse Amendment 2 and Proposition C, but she said she was skeptical of Amendment 3 and she was not offering an endorsement for that one. So next up, Josh will go over some brief history on medical marijuana.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, in the past, I mean, there have been 31 states and DC have legalized medical marijuana, and 15 of those states did so through the citizen initiative process. So I see there sort of certainly a higher percentage through the legislative process, but still half of them have used citizen initiatives. In 2016, medical marijuana was sort of a big issue in general with California and 4 other states on the ballot for recreational, but for medical, initiatives were approved in Arkansas, Florida, and North Dakota. The last time a medical marijuana initiative was defeated was in 2014 in Florida. It actually received 58% approval, but as Ryan mentioned earlier, there's a 60% requirement in Florida. And then a measure passed in 2016. So the last time medical marijuana measures were defeated with just a majority vote requirement was in Arkansas in 2012 and South Dakota in 2010. If you're looking for more sort of historical context for the marijuana movement specifically on the ballot, you can go to ballotpedia.org/history of marijuana on the ballot and see a long list of all the measures that have been on the ballot and sort of some analysis of them. But we can move on, and we're going to kind of look at what's next with medical marijuana like we did for recreational, because more states have implemented some sort of program for medical marijuana. There are fewer opportunities available for the initiative process to play a role in more states legalizing. But you can see there are 2 states, Utah and Missouri, that have a vote in November. There are a lot of sort of some similarities with regard to the regions that have legalized, but there's just a lot more states. And the states that are left over that have not implemented some sort of program and have the initiative process, you can see highlighted there the Mississippi, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Idaho. So there's only 4 states left. In Mississippi, initiatives can only be constitutional, and it's not a particularly active state with regard to the initiative process, historically speaking, but that option is available there. So that's kind of a rundown of what could be in the future as far as medical marijuana passing through a ballot initiative. And I wanted to sort of end the webinar with sort of a review of just 2018 ballot measures in general. So kind of put these in the context of direct democracy in 2018. So there are 157 total statewide measures in 37 states in November. The 12 were already decided at pre-November elections, so there's 169 total. Of those, you're looking at 65 in November that are citizen initiated, so actually put on the ballot through a petition process. Notable topics include redistricting and elections policy, restrictions on taxes, Medicaid expansion and healthcare, energy, Marsy's Law, which is a crime victims' rights movement, abortion, and minimum wage. And one measure that's getting a lot of attention is also Ohio Issue 1, which relates to reducing some penalties for certain crimes, specifically drug possession. It would make offenses drug possession no more than misdemeanors, and it has other provisions sort of related to reducing prison population, including prohibiting courts from ordering persons on probation to be sent back to prison for non-criminal probation violations, and other sort of sentencing program provisions. So yeah, that's that. If there's any questions at all about either marijuana measures or about other measures that are on the ballot in 2018, you can reach Ryan or myself through the emails listed on this slide. And I think we're going to open it up to questions right now. Is that right, Kayla?
Yes, yeah. It looks like we already have one question that came through the Q&A. Did Prop 2 for Utah designate where the tax revenue would be distributed?
Let me look that up real quick. I should have had that on the slide. I'm just going to our Ballotpedia page on Proposition 2. If you Google Utah Proposition 2, it should come up. Actually, if you could send an email, I'll answer that question in more detail via email.
Okay, great. If there are any other questions, you can drop those in the Q&A tool or using the chat. We'll just keep the floor open for one more minute for those. Cool. While we wait to hear if there are any more ballot measures, we'll make a quick plug for next week. We are talking about all of the measures on Colorado ballots in November, in a couple weeks here. So please join us for that. If you're interested, you can subscribe to our email notification updates, or email me back and let me know, and I will get you on that list. Cool. I'm not seeing any more questions. Do you want anything else to add, Josh or Ryan?
Oh, no, nothing to add from me. I just want to thank everyone for attending this webinar to learn more about the marijuana-related ballot measures in 2018.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, for your time. You'll get an email tomorrow with a link to this recording and as well as a link to the presentation that we used today. Okay, thank you all so much. Have a nice day.